Under modern classification of accounts, the accounts can be classified under 5 basic categories. They are assets. We all know what are assets. Assets are things of value that a business owns, or they are the economic resources of an enterprise. For example, cash, building, machinery, they are all categorized as assets. The second classification is liabilities. The amounts payable by the business to outsiders is classified as liabilities. The third classification under the modern system is capital. Money invested by the owner in the business. Something which belongs to the owner or the accounts which relate to the owner are categorized under this classification. Next one being revenue. Accounts which relate to generation of income like sales, etc. are classified under this category. Then we have last one being expenses. The amount that a business spends to earn revenue are called as expenses. They are like salaries paid, interest paid, rent paid. They are all covered under the category of expenses. So now these are 5 broad categories: assets, liabilities, capital, revenue and expenses. Now students, the rules of debit and credit are based on these classifications. So let us understand them as well. Increase and decrease. Now students, if the assets increase, they are debited. The rule is, if there is an increase in asset, then they must be debited. Whereas, if the assets decrease or their values decline, then they must be credited. Coming to liabilities. Liabilities are the amounts payable. Now students, if the liabilities increase, then they must be credited. And if there is a decrease in liability, then the liability account should be debited. So the rule for liabilities is, if there is an increase in liability, it must be credited, whereas any decrease in the amount of liability should be debited. Coming to capital. Now remember, capital is also a liability that the business has to pay, but it is payable to the owner. Or we can say that the owner is a creditor of the business to the extent of his capital. So since it can be classified as an internal liability, the rules are same. If there is an increase in capital, it must be credited, whereas any decrease must be debited. Coming to revenues, there are incomes. Any increase in the revenue should be credited, whereas any decrease should be debited. And it is exactly the opposite for expenses. Any increase in the expense should be debited, whereas any decrease in this amount should be credited. So now the rules are, for assets, any increase should be debited, decrease should be credited. For liabilities, it is the opposite, increase should be credited, decrease should be debited. For capital, increase credited and decrease debited. The same thing holds for revenue, but for expenses it is debit the increase and credit the decrease.